In this video, I want to talk about our camera. So I know most of us use phones, but there are some of us that use a camera. I'm one of them. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about the concepts behind your camera, how your camera is working, so to hopefully move you off of auto mode so that you can get into you can have more control with your photographs. So there's something known as the exposure triangle. What that consists of are three elements: ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Now, those might sound like foreign words to you, foreign concepts, but don't worry, I'm not going to get too technical. I definitely don't want to bog you down on the technical side of photography. It's more about teaching you how to see, but sometimes it's easier to be able to change some things and to be able to get more control when you kind of know what's going on behind the scenes. So your camera is always trying to get a perfect exposure. That means how much light is coming into your camera to make that perfect photograph. The first part of the exposure triangle that I want to talk about is called ISO. What ISO is, it just tells your camera how sensitive it is to light. Now, ISO can range in numbers from about 100 to 6,400 or even higher, 12,800. The numbers can go really high. Now, what those numbers mean are the lower the number, the less sensitive your camera is to light, and the higher the number, the more sensitive your camera is to light. So what does that mean? All you really need to know is the brighter it is, the lower the ISO number. The darker it is, the higher the ISO number. And sometimes people say you need to bump up your ISO. That just means it's dark out, it's not enough light, and you need to increase the ISO setting. The next part of the exposure triangle is aperture, or also called f-stops. Aperture works kind of like the pupils in your eyes. So have you ever been to the eye doctor and they want to put some drops in your eyes to dilate your pupil, to make your pupil really big so they can see what's going on in the back of your eye? That's kind of how aperture works. Aperture determines the opening of your lens. So that's how much light you're allowing in. So going back to the example of going to the eye doctor, when your pupil is dilated and your pupil is really big, your eyes get really uncomfortable because all of the light is coming into your pupils and things might seem blurry. That's kind of how aperture works. The bigger the opening is in your lens, the more light that's being allowed into your camera. The thing is, the more light that's allowed into your camera with a bigger aperture, with a bigger opening, the less that's actually in focus. So if you've ever seen photographs where the background is nice and blurry, but the subject is really sharp, that's because they're using a low number aperture. So for example, an f-stop of f2.8 means that the opening is really big, but the amount that's in focus is really small. Now, conversely, let's say you have an aperture of f16. That means a lot more of your photograph is going to be in focus, but the hole or the opening of your lens is really small. I know it could be confusing, like why is the bigger number the smaller opening, but that's just how it is. So kind of an easy way to remember this is, let's say you have an aperture of 2.8. Let's think, okay, let's say I'm photographing people, maybe that means only 2 people will be in focus. If I want a big crowd of people to be in focus, or if I'm doing a landscape photo and I want a lot of my landscape to be in focus, then I want my aperture to be higher. So then I would be maybe an f16 or an f22. So remember, the higher the f-stop number, the more that's going to be in focus in your photograph. The next part of the exposure triangle that I want to talk about is called shutter speed. And that's when you press your camera, the button on your camera and you hear that click sound, that's actually your shutter opening and closing. Now the shutter refers to the amount of time that the shutter is open to allow the light to come in. So a quick shutter speed means there's not going to be a lot of time for the light to come in. A longer shutter speed means the shutter is going to stay open longer, allowing for more light to come in. Now, the longer the shutter is open, there's more of a chance that your photos will be blurry because it's harder to hold your camera steady. The shutter is going to be open. It's going to allow more light, but there is a chance for it to be a little blurrier. For example, when you're photographing action, so maybe you're at your kid's sports event, or you want to photograph someone running or skateboarding or rollerblading or a train moving by or a car moving by, any kind of motion, you want to have a fast shutter speed. So the shutter speeds are also numbers, and they're different ranges. So let's say you have a shutter speed of 250. It's really 250th of a second that your shutter is open. So the smaller the number, the longer the shutter is going to be open. The bigger the number, the shorter amount of time it's going to be open. So let's say you have a shutter speed of 50. It's really 1/50th of a second, which is slower than a shutter speed of 250 because that's 1/250th of a second. Again, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed all work together. So when your camera is in auto mode, your camera is figuring out all those settings for you based on the amount of light that it sees. But if you want to take more control of your camera, you can learn how to change those settings on your own. But don't freak out. You don't have to go automatically from auto mode to manual mode. Where in manual mode, you are adjusting all of the settings. But there are some modes in between that you can use to practice on so that you don't have to think about all of the settings at once. And I'm going to go through those settings, those different modes with you right now.